internet.
For a quiz for the folks that didn't show up.
The quiz, yeah, let's have a
Quiz.
quiz, pop quiz. This is up on, I'm back up on the internet, so all the stuff is being posted because I was finally able to work out on my computer glitches, irritants. So anyway, we're going back. Now today, everyone who isn't here today will want to review it because today I have all the words basically that represent sacrifice in Greek. The only word I don't have, which is the non-sacrificial oblations like Doron, they're not included, but all the other sacrifices are included. You know why, right? Because if we look at our sacrifices, the Hebraic sacrifices, we have the ascension sacrifice, we have the sin, and we have the guilt sacrifice. We have the priest sacrifice, and we have the Thanksgiving sacrifice. The biggest one is the Thanksgiving sacrifice. All of them are specific sacrifices. On the other side of the board, we have Harmantia, which is miss the mark. We have antinomia, which is basically breaking a commandment. This is what we call this sin. This is breaking a commandment to us is sin. And then we have finally, what's a Greek word? I think it's Carthasis. Anyway, it's cleansing or cleanliness. So what we have is we have these specific, if you want to call them sins or problems in humanity. What is cleanliness? Well, cleanliness isn't really. When I'm baptized, does the baptism actually, no kidding, take away all the sin? It says in the baptism, what do you have to have? Water and
The Word.
the Word. And the Word isn't what the pastor says over you. What is the Word?
Jesus.
That's where? Where does it have to be? What is the power of baptism? Is the water and the Word, but where's the Word? In you, right? If I just take a sprinkle and I go and I blow them away with the water, it doesn't do any good, does it? And we would say as Lutherans that if you confess the Lord Jesus Christ, is that sufficient? Now, some argue because of the guy on the cross, the brigand on the cross, right, that, yeah, that's sufficient. But we would say that you also need baptism, because baptism is the spiritual, is the reflection of the spiritual, of a spiritual thing. And that's what Hebrews is talking to us, right? Yes, sir.
The thief on the cross, Christ forgave him prior to his order of baptize all nations. So that was prior to Christ's command to baptize, and it's subject to his divinity. He can do whatever he wants.
I don't disagree with that. However, this is a fight, and this is great, because this is a fight through all of Christendom, even today. The fight is a confession of Christ sufficient, or do I also need baptism of some kind? And, baptism of some kind, Baptists immerse, which, by the way, baptismo means to immerse in Greek. We pour, some sprinkle, Orthodox, immerse. Catholics will pour or sprinkle, right? There are different groups. The Church of Christ say, if you are not baptized, Ain't working. We say, if you're not baptized, it ain't working, right? Catholics say, all the Orthodox groups, liturgical and Orthodox, basically believe that if you don't also baptize, confession is not sufficient because it's the water and the word. But the word is a confession. Okay? So, you know, this is, yes, sir.
Yeah, the Baptists believe in the immersion, but then they don't attach any significance to it.
Right, you can be baptized many times.
Yeah, and it's all in your profession of faith, and there's no significance to the water, although you have to be immersed. It's not logical.
They call it a symbol, and what they've done is they've gone the whole way. We also call it we don't like to call it a symbol. We use the Greek words. Remember the Greek word? Archetype, right? It's an archetype. It is a die, so it's not it is not the actual thing, but it is a die that is cut, right? Just like a coin is cut.
Right.
So it stands in the place of whatever that miraculous cleansing power is that God has.
We call it a sacrament, which is a physical representation of a spiritual truth.
Bingo. Bingo. Exactly. This is really important, though, because all of a sudden, cleansing, you know, right now, if we're talking about the Jewish cleansing, right? Most of us go, oh, that's not important. That's just a Jewish thing. That's not important. Who told them to do it? God did. And Hebrews is reflecting that. And the cleansing that they did, what did they do to achieve cleansing? Cleanliness. The mikvah. The mikvah, which is an immersion. Okay? So, yeah,
The Baptists, they say I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They do also believe.
Yes.
We do, because we accept their baptism. We accept their baptism. We will accept the
No, the
baptism.
disciples of Christ, I knew this one gal used to talk to her quite a bit, but she joined the Disciples of Christ Church on Hillside, Hillside Christian Church. Anyway, she said, they want to rebaptize me. I'm not going to do that. I've been baptized already. I'm not going to get baptized again. So I don't know what happened. But they insisted she be if they get baptized in the Christian church, Methodist church, we accept it.
Lutherans croaked Anabaptists because Anabaptists insisted people be baptized. Who is that group? There's Calvinists, and who's the total anti-Calvinist? Calvinist. You remember what's his name, Tammy?
I'm thinking.
Anybody remember? It's one of the great theological.
Zwingli?
No. There's a great theological. There's the.
Not Wesley.
Well, the Anabaptists come out of this group, but what was the name of the guy? The guy who invented it, or not invented, but wrote it down. Huh?
Not Wesley.
Calvin versus. I haven't taught this in a million years. It's a basis of a huge number of theologians, theological viewpoints. Okay, we are the Catholics. Okay, the Catholics, Orthodox. However you want to do it. Let's say the Orthodox. Okay, the Orthos are where everything started. The Orthodox, the Catholics, everybody, and us. Natural theology. We are natural theologists, okay? In the Reformation, okay, the Reformation caused two great groups to come out of it. There's natural theology, and out of it came the Calvinist, which is reformed. We are not reformed theology. The Reformed theology and the Anabaptist, who was, what was his name?
Armenian?
Huh?
Is it Armenian?
Arminius.
Arminius?
I think it's Arminius. I think that's right.
Conrad Grebel Felix Mons and Zwingli are the ones they list in Wikipedia.
Armenian, I think it's Arminius.
Yeah, I think you're
I
right.
think it's Armenian.
Not Anabaptist.
Anyway, the Calvinists said, you have no choice. You are saved because God pronounced you would be saved from the beginning of creation. You have no choice. The Anabaptists said, it's all choice. It's complete choice. You choose. Natural theologists, which is usins, take a very strange middle-of-the-road group, a middle-of-the-road, which basically has issues, but you can go wherever you want with that, okay? Because we see that in the New Testament throughout, the word for faith is pistis, which means to be convinced. So to be convinced, that means you have made a choice. So I'm not going to yak about theology in any of this. I'm just going to point out that in the Greek, there is a huge thing, and we play the middle of the road on this issue, okay? Whether it's absolute choice or it's an absolute human choice, we say the Holy Spirit comes to you and facilitates the choice. Yeah, but we still say there's a choice, which is,
Sure.
okay, forget what you want to do theologically. This gets really deep, okay, very quick. But this is a very interesting view. So the big deal is, though, how that affects baptism, right? Because the Anabaptists, Baptists, and that whole group would say baptism is not required.
It's optional.
It's an option because it's the choice that matters, right? The Calvinists would say, I don't know what the Calvinists say about baptism, because they have an irrational view. I mean, if you're already saved and it is just fated, which is the exact opposite of the view of the New Testament, then who cares, right? Because even if I'm Hitler, if I'm the chosen, then I'm okay. On the other hand, natural theology says that it's a requirement of water, the symbol of things that are spiritual, and the word, which is the choice. And so this is where this huge everything comes out of. But my point to you is this. It's obvious to me, how important is this cleanliness idea to God? How important does it seem to be to us?
Very important.
Not as much. Although, you see, we talk about baptism, and I think that's right. I think we don't talk enough about baptism. And what I mean by that isn't so much that baptism, quote, saves you, although that's a belief we have, right? Baptism with the word together save, right? Not by itself, but with the word. So the big deal here is that there is an importance that God has placed that is enormous on cleanliness. And so remember, if you did not do the mikvah, what could you not do? And Tammy told me I should have repeatedly told you what this word means. But remember, teruma is the food that has been sacrificed in the temple. So the thanksgiving, and here's a key that'll help you remember, teruma is the thanksgiving sacrifice. So if you want to eat of the Thanksgiving sacrifice, you must be cleansed by the mikvah. They did the mikvah how often?
Once a month?
More often than you want to imagine. Women had to do it once a month after their menstrual cycle. Men were supposed to do it anytime they had a discharge of semen. And there are other specific points where you did a mikvah. But that meant you were, luckily, they were not a bathing society, but they're getting immersed. And who did the immersion? Did you do it, or did somebody do it to you? No, you did it yourself.
You walked in.
The mikvah was all yourself. As a matter of fact, we believe that early baptism, no one baptized you. It was like the mikvah. You were in body of water that met the criteria of a mikvah, like flowing water or a specific water area that was legal as mikvah, or a rain-filled, cistern, and that you put yourself under the water. Now, if somebody said some words above you, you are baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that's cool. It became, why do we baptize people? The reason we baptize people is because the same reason that the priests began to kill the sacrifice. The sacrifices originally, if you go look, and I probably need to reteach the Torah class I taught like a bazillion years ago. But in the Torah, if you look in the Torah, it says that you shall kill the sacrifice yourself. The sacrifice, you do it. The reason they stopped doing that, according to Josephus, is because every now and then, well, quite often, somebody would glitz it up and not cut it properly. And then what happened? What did the priest say?
Gotta get another animal.
It didn't count. Look, but you know what? Your animal didn't work. But I got one here on sale for you. I'll sell it to you. Guess what? I guarantee it's free of blemish. Right? It was up in the hills of Judea in Bethlehem. So that is what caused the priest to begin to kill the sacrifices for the person who brought it. So we did the same thing, because the question in the early church was, like the mikvah, is everything under the water? It doesn't, right? A mikvah is not a mikvah unless every part of your body, naked, is submerged. Your hair has to be submerged if it's floating. Everything has to be submerged. You can't have any ornamentation or anything on your body. So the mikvah, you had to be completely naked. By the way, the Orthodox Church does that today. You're completely naked when you are baptized. So it was not done to you, but the early church wanted to make sure that they were doing it right. And so therefore they began to have the pastors, the deacons, those who were baptizing people, actually doing it. But most likely when John the Baptist and Jesus, or his disciples, Jesus didn't baptize anyone, but when his disciples baptized people, they simply said, now immerse yourself. And like a mikveh, they had probably a stick, and they made sure that all the parts of your hair and your body were under the water. Maybe they took the stick and smacked it in the head. Get down in the water, right? Make sure you're all under. The point is, though, the mikveh allows you to have teruma. That's also the priest. The priests, if they were not clean, could not eat the priestly sacrifice. This was a Holocaust sacrifice. These are very interesting, and it's very hard to contain because they appear to be somewhat Holocaust sacrifices, but parts were also there. This is a one day, a daily sacrifice done at the temple. These are somewhat rare. This is daily. And this is, you bring 10% of everything to give to the Thanksgiving sacrifice. This is the tithe. T for tithe, T for teruma, T for Thanksgiving sacrifice. This is what you brought. So you participated. So this sacrifice, and you say, what about the wave sacrifice? Yes, there are wave sacrifices. Wave sacrifices also fit within here. The point is, as we look at the word of the day, and here's the word for the day. Remember last week I gave you hello. Well, I wanted to leave it on, but I didn't have any space. Halokatoma. 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 Halokatoma is whole burn. Holy burn. Holy, this is the Holocaust sacrifice. Halokatoma really only applies per se to the ascension sacrifice. It might apply to sin and guilt. But this word...
No, that's fine.
Question.
No,
Go ahead.
Burn, consumed, I'm assuming the same thing.
Yeah,
Consumed would be,
wholly consumed.
it has to be fully consumed, nothing left but ashes.
Yeah, totally burned. These were not wholly consumed. Go back and look at the notes that I gave you before, or look at the Torah. In the guilt and sin sacrifice, there were, like, for example, a hide was kept. The hide was kept by the priest. And the wave sacrifice, there was a wave sacrifice that they actually ate that was part of the sin and guilt sacrifice. So this gets a little complicated, but, you know, the best thing is to have dash line here because this isn't really fully. This is P-R-O-S-P-H-O-R-A-S. And to correctly pronounce this, that's the phi sound, which is like the. So, prosphora. Prosphora. But it comes from this word, P-R-O-S-P-H-E-R-O-N-T-A-I. And I'm not going to go through the declension, but prosphero. Prosphero. This is the word that we've been talking about forever. Prosphero is basically toward, bear. Bear. To bear toward. So this is the word that has been used all through Hebrew. Remember, to bear toward God. There's the other word, to bear toward the marketplace. Right? Remember that? This word, prosphoros. Prosphoros means to, specifically, it comes out of prosphero. And remember I told you, prosphero means always is a sacrifice. You're bearing the sacrifice. It's always a sacrifice. However, prospheros is that which is brought, that which is born. The difference is, this is sacrifice, being born toward God, where this is anything. For example, a doron, right? A doron, which is not necessarily a sacrifice. Now, this word, T-H-U-S-I-A-S, thusias, thusa. A thusa is always a sacrifice. And what's really cool about this word, thusa comes from thuo, and I hope you can read that. I tried to find another color that was a little brighter, but remember, we have sarx, suke, and pneuma. Thuo happens to be thuo, is the basis for thusia. It means to rush, to breathe hard, to blow smoke. By implication, a sacrifice by fire, but that's not what it means, because we also know breathing and blowing, they're the two other words, right? There's suke, which is the unconscious breath, and there's pneuma, which is the conscious breath, and then there is thuo, thusia, thuo. Thuo and thusia, I'll let you guess what breath that is. It's very interesting because this is get a little bit gross, but you know, when you kill an animal or when someone dies, what do we call that last breath? Death rattle. Yeah, death rattle. There's a last breath that people make. There's also a last death gasp that when you kill an animal in a sacrifice. This word does not necessarily mean, although it does give an implication of metaepithumia, the smell, the scent of the sacrifice as it's cooking. The implication here is a breath that is forced through death. In other words, when the suke is released, you get a thusa, right? And the Greeks would probably, the Greeks wouldn't go for that because they believed that only humans had a suke, right? But guess who did? The Hebrews said that man and animals. Man is Adam, and animals are Adam. Adam just means dirt, physical. And nefesh. Nephesh is not the breath of God. Nephesh is the breath that God placed in both man and animals at the beginning in Genesis. So, when you kill an animal or a human, that last breath is a thusa. And of course, it applies directly to sacrifice, because what is the sacrifice? We think the sacrifice is when you take the animal and you cook it or you burn it or whatever you're doing, right? That's not the sacrifice. The sacrifice is when you take the life of the animal. That is the sacrifice. So, Thusa directly applies to that. This is really deep stuff, because, now look at our chart. In my chart, my antinomia, my sin is basically affected by the ascension and sin and guilt. But the most important thing in the New Testament is miss the mark. And remember, this only worked for unintentional sin, right? Where there are two things that are intentional here. There's intentional sin and intentional hit the mark, right? Hit the mark. Can I hit the mark without intent? I mean, I guess maybe it would be possible if I put over my back, right, and accidentally hit it in a 1 in a bazillion chance. But the Greeks are not that stupid. They would say, "You're kidding me, right? If you didn't intend to hit the mark, the probability is you're never going to hit it. And why would it? And if you shot it this way and the mark's over here, there's no way you're going to hit it, right? So by the way, even if I shoot it over my shoulder, I have a intention to hit the mark. Hit the mark is the intent. And by the way, which of these sacrifices imply intent? This doesn't. These don't. This kind of, because this is, the pre-sacrifice. The Thanksgiving sacrifice, you are bringing your 10% to God for the intent of doing what? You are sharing in the deity. You are sharing with God in a meal. This is really kind of interesting stuff. But let's look at Hebrews in this context, because they're trying to answer this question. And this question isn't just the Hebrew question. The Hebrew question is this: what about cleanliness, right? And the answer from the Christians is baptism. It's the mikvah, right? It's a baptism. They say, well, what about antinomia? And they said, that's handled. Who did it? Jesus Christ, and the sacrifice of Christ handled antinomia. What about miss the mark? There's no sacrifice for miss the mark. The only thing you can do about miss the mark, any of your sin or any of the fact that you didn't miss the mark is forgiven. But what are they telling you to do? Go and try to hit the mark, right? Do the intent. Let's see what it says. Let's see, we were in 6, and I think we just finished 6. What I want to do is I want to go back over on 6. Not the whole thing, I just want to read the 6 in the literal. So, and also, yes, sir.
Sorry, just one comment on the miss the mark.
Yeah.
So the miss the mark is not living up to your full potential necessarily. You've been given the mark and you haven't attained it. Well, so therefore you're not living up to your full potential and not giving as much tithe as you could. So it has a direct effect possibly on your Thanksgiving.
I don't think it's even necessarily the tithe.
Yeah, it's not necessarily tithe, right?
It's fulfilling what God has laid out before you.
Yeah, it's fulfilling. Max, see, miss the mark. And the reason miss the mark is used so much in the New Testament is because miss the mark incorporates all of this. You see, to us, we have gotten in this thing about sin, right? And in the New Testament, they got into this thing about sin. If I don't give the right tithe of cumin and the tithe of this and that and the tithe of... I've sinned. And Jesus came in and blew him away and said, no, you didn't. What are you thinking? What's wrong with you? Right? Yeah. You know, God calls you to not sin, to not antinomia. But I don't want you sitting there and just counting your cumin. I mean, literally, the Pharisees would sit there counting their cumin to make sure they gave their 10%. And then what did they do with the 10%? They didn't give it to the temple. They didn't give it to the synagogue. They didn't give it to the poor. What did you do with it? You ate it.
You got most of it back.
You got it all back, yeah. You got it all back. You know, we think the Pharisees were some kind of goody-goody two-shoes guys. They were, look, they were spending all their day making sure that they had the tithe so they could go and pig out. And God doesn't say there's something wrong with that per se. What he says is they were missing the mark. The mark wasn't that they were supposed to tithe cumin and all this other stuff. The mark was they were supposed to, by the way, in the Thanksgiving sacrifice, the big deal about the Thanksgiving sacrifice, both in the Old and New Testament, who eats it?
People that bring it.
The people that bring it, but there's more to it than that. We missed the point that when they brought all their tithe to the temple and they cooked it and ate it, number one, they had really good cooking pots that no one could own. So they could actually cook it so it was reasonably tasty, right? But when you cooked it and you made it, especially when you cooked it in pots, what does that mean when you cook it in a pot?
It's all together, like you don't put back your own, is that what you're going for?
Yeah,
Combined.
it's combined. They had these huge vessels. Okay, you got to go back and figure out what they ate and how they ate. We think everybody has copper cooking pots made by what's that fancy company with, cover on it that, it's skid proof, right? And everybody cooks all this food and they have all, roasts and all this other thing. No one had any pots. The only people who had pots in this period were very wealthy people. The Roman legion, if you read my book Centurion, we know every Roman legion was issued 2 big pots to cook the meal. When I say meal, I mean meal, like porridge. That's what they ate. Every morning and every night they had porridge, and usually at night they might get a piece of cheese and some, they get beer. People ate horribly. People believed that when you're in the Roman legion, because you got porridge, you actually could have muscles. Although they were eating porridge and not much meat, they actually had something to eat. The average person in Ruth, we know they were eating crack. They were roasting kernels. They could make bread, but bread took anyone made bread? Bread is a process, right? Bread is not easy to make. It's really good.
You burn calories making it.
Yeah, you burn more calories making it. Yeah. So people had very little to eat. And so when you went to the temple, one of the big deals, look at the temple stuff. What did they have in the temples? They had these pots. Every time you read about the temple and when it was, when people came and stole stuff from it or whatever, they took the pots. The reason they had pots is not only did they have a big pot that was called the sea, that was the mikvah, that you could wash your hands and feet in. And we don't know about other mikvah, but there was a thing called the sea that was huge. We think people washed actually completely like a mikvah in that early. But later on, they were just washing their hands and feet in the sea. But the big deal is they had pots, and so they bring the Thanksgiving sacrifice, and it was 10% of everything, right? Cumin, coriander, salt, pepper, meat, vegetables.
So that's where the potluck came from.
That's where potluck came from. So I throw it all in the pot and I cook it together.
You're lucky
And
you got something really good.
because you brought some and you brought some and you brought some, then you all shared. That's why it was a Thanksgiving meal. It was a shared meal. The priest shared in it, the people that were all there shared in it, and you shared in it. Our Eucharist matches that. You know, in the past, and we don't do it today, we have our individual wafers. But in the past, they would take it and break it from the wafer. And you would get a broken piece of Christ's body, right? A communion. We do our little individual cups, that's cute. But in a communion, what do? You share the common cup. We share in it just like they shared the Thanksgiving sacrifice. This is where it came from. This was not invented by the church. John Chrysostom, when he put together the liturgy of the church, Paul, remember in Paul, when they came together for the Seder meals that were the Eucharistic meals? They all brought something, and Paul said, you should share with your neighbor. He was talking to Greeks. How much did the Greek understand about the Hebrew Thanksgiving sacrifice? They had no clue. He wasn't beating them up. He was instructing them in how this works. And guess what he was instructing us in? Because we are supposed to read the letters, and we kind of ignore them, right? But Paul's letters, remember Paul lost. John Chrysostom won. So because Paul lost, we don't get lamb at our Eucharist. But Paul wanted us to have lamb at the Seder, at the Eucharist. So every Eucharist, and by the way, in the early church, what were they doing in the temple? They were sacrificing to have the Thanksgiving sacrifice, which was their Eucharist, because their meat was sacrificed properly, and they could participate in it as a Jewish people. Because remember, Teen Hodos is Jewish. Anyway, this stuff is so beautiful in my opinion. We're talking about Psalm 40. And I'm going to quickly read Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not look to the proud, to those, who turn aside to false gods. Many, O God, this is 5. O Lord my God, that's many, O Yahweh, my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you have planned for us. No one can recount to you. Were I to speak and tell of them, they would be too many to declare. 6, this is the one that's requoted here in 6, 7, and 8. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have pierced. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. Then he said, here I am, I have come, it is written about me in the scroll. I desire to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. I proclaim righteousness in the great assembly. I do not seal my lips, as you know, Lord. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire. Now we're going to see what words those are specifically used in the New Testament from the Septuagint. Remember, this is a quote of the Septuagint. But my ears you have pierced. Now this is a very huge difference from the Hebrew, from the Septuagint, and from our quote. But why would they say, but my ears you have pierced? Anybody have any idea what that has to do with anything?
Weren't slaves pierced?
If you were a freed slave and you decided to remain a slave of your master, then your master in the Torah was required to put your head on the post of the door and put an awl through it. Therefore, this person is declaring, whoever wrote this psalm, I don't know if it says it's a Psalm of David, remember those are all added later in the Septuagint. But sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have pierced. In other words, I was a slave, you freed me, and I decided to stay with you. My ears you have pierced. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. Then I said, here I am, I have come. It is written about me in the scroll. I desire to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. The thing I want to point out to you is this. Every Hebrew, and probably every Greek and Roman, and anyone who'd studied this at all, knows precisely what he's talking about. He is not talking about all sacrifices. he's talking specifically about burnt offerings and sin offerings, because there is burnt offerings, Holocaust, there are sin offerings and guilt offerings, there are the priest offerings and the thanksgiving offerings. There is also cleanliness, antinomia, or sin, and miss the mark. These are the key things that this specific chapter, or logos, this specific logos to telos, is trying to talk to us about. Telos. In 6 in the NIV says, with burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased. And here's a translation from the Septuagint and from the Greek. This we already did this, so I won't go back through it again, but I'll just give you the literal. You don't think well of wholly set on fire and through, literally pierced, missed the mark. Pierced, missed the mark. That's where they got that pierced. The pierced, when it went to the Septuagint, became a different, I don't know if they're using a different version when the rabbis put it down, but you see how they did it in the Hebrew. And I didn't give you the Hebrew translation. I'm sorry. If I were really good, I'd probably spend a whole class and we go through the Hebrew translation of Psalm 40. I don't remember if I did that for you before in the Psalm class. But if we went through the Psalm, we would probably find that the Hebrew is ambivalent. Remember, Hebrew is very euphemistic and hard to pin down. Where when they wrote it in the Greek, they wanted to pin it down. And the pin down part they wanted to tell you was, you don't think well of the Holocaust, and literally they were saying the sin sacrifice. So we can catch that right directly from it. Let's go to 7. Then I said, here I am. This is the same as, it's interesting, this is also the 7th verse, or, yeah, 7th verse, because they're added, of the Psalm. Then I said, here I am, it is written about me in the scroll, I have come to do your will. This is beautiful in the Greek. Then, literally, tote, then when, epo, not logos, epo. Basically, I said. I is added and implied. I said, ido, look, lo. I is added, but it's implied. Heko, not come, arrive. When I arrive, nd is added. It's not volume. It's kaphalis. Remember kaphalis? Kaphalis comes from kaphala, and kaphalis is the knob, literally the stick on which a scroll is rolled. The kaphalis, the knob of the is added. The biblion, a roll of papyrus. The roll of papyrus. It is written, graphio, through. Literally the word is peri, it's pierced. It means it's not a preposition. We made it a preposition in the translation, but it means to pierce. Pierced me, imo, of me, to do, poio, to make or do, thy, so, literally, thy, thelema, determination. We've had a lot of thelema before. O, theos, O is added. This is what the literal translation here is. Then when I said, look, I arrive in a stick on which a scroll was rolled of a roll of papyrus written through, literally pierced, and about me to make thy determination God. Very interesting statement. Then when I said, look, I arrive in a stick on which a scroll was rolled of a roll of papyrus written through, pierced, and about me to make thy determination. In other words, in the Greek, now, I don't know, I didn't take the Hebrew to retranslate it for you, but in the Greek, the assumption of this statement is not that the roll is pierced, not that an ear is pierced, but rather that the kaphela, the stick, does what? It goes through the scroll, and it holds the scroll together. In other words, okay, we don't get it because we don't do scrolls. How hard is it to handle a scroll if you don't have a stick running through the scroll? Try it someday. In other words, this is a very interesting statement because there's a multiple meaning in this. I arrived on a stick. It's also a double meaning. Who arrived on a stick?
Christ.
Jesus Christ, right? He was sacrificed. Who else arrived on a stick? Remember when Moses put the stick up with the thing on it in the wilderness, right? Right? And a scroll arrives on a stick. Now, what's really interesting about that, they use the word biblion. Biblion. So, what would be on a biblion? What would be on a papyrus roll? Because almost all the Torah scrolls were written on what? Hides, vellum. Yeah, vellum. Vellum is what you put those scrolls on. The papyrus was used for lower value things. So we could guess maybe it was the Septuagint. Maybe it's the Tanakh. Since this is a quote from Psalms, maybe it's maybe it's one of the Psalms. Because usually the scrolls that I put on vellum, right, were the scrolls of the Tanakh, the Torah scroll, right? The Ruth scroll, the Esther scroll. These are the scrolls that were read all the time in the synagogues. So those would probably be put on vellum as opposed to a biblion. A biblion can also apply to all literature, all Greek literature, all Hebrew literature. The reason I bring this up is because I just want to point out, the Greeks did not believe that there was any bad writing. They believed that if anyone had the ability, the money, and the reasoning to write it down, then it was worth reading. And remember, worth reading means memorizing, because they didn't read it the way we expect people to read it. They would memorize it. So even the most odd and obtuse document, right, had a book slave attached to it. How valuable is that? Every book had a book slave. You know, we think of books. Here's my book. I bought it over at Barnes & Noble, or I bought it here or there, right? And I paid $10, $20, $30. What's the value of a slave? Now, propaganda will tell you they weren't worth much. That's crazy. We know in ancient times the value of a slave was anywhere between $1,000 to $20,000, maybe even higher, depending on their skill level. So a book slave was probably worth someplace, let's say in the middle of that, maybe high end, so $10,000. And we know that every book was the value of a 40-acre farm, a 40-acre, farm. So anyway, books are very valuable. We'll start there. Again, I'm sorry we didn't have much time. Oh, by the way, let's have a quick prayer. Thank you, Father, for your word. I pray you'd look after us this week. But we also need, amen. But we also need to vote and make sure, does anyone want for class next week?
I do.
Should you have class next week, or should you go